Well, good evening and welcome. It's great to see everyone here this evening. Just selfishly, just to be back from sabbatical and re-see everyone. I think a lot of people here know that we have moved from the hobby farm, River Falls Horse Farm, and are now in Minneapolis. So thank you, Jose. Well, and seriously, if TCC does anything well, it is community, and I did want to just indulge my personal side and thank everyone who has just stopped by or walked or helped me make sense of the flower jungle or all those things, because it really is just wonderful and super thankful. So, and again, it's great to be together. So if you're visiting Twin Cities Church, Wednesday evenings we have a teaching series. We are going through the book of Ecclesiastes, which I really appreciate. I think all of us can identify, traditionally it's King Solomon is given credit as the author, so he's really asking those existential questions, which I think we all ask, the meaning of life, what gives my life purpose, the inevitability of death, and he is just hitting all those things through that. And then after time, we actually do a question and answer time. So we'll have kind of that typical 20 to 30 minute lecture time. But if, as you hear the teaching, there's something that you hear that you're like, boy, I'd like to know more about that, or I didn't quite understand that, or I'd like to make a comment on that, just jot it down, because then we'll have, at least 20 to 30 minutes of question time, which really is great and just a robust time. Our teaching series is designed so that everyone can feel welcome wherever you're at in your spiritual journey, whether you're a member of Twin Cities Church or you're not, whether you consider yourself a Christian or not. We really want it to be an open time to look together at the biblical text and then be able to have a discussion and interact together. So great to see everybody here tonight. Just a couple of bookkeeping items. Well, maybe I should back up. So this TCC, we have this on Wednesday nights. If you're looking for something maybe more robust, more really centered on Christian growth, so on Sundays, we meet throughout homes in the Twin Cities and have house churches. So that's where we really consider the life of the church, where we have a meal together, we pray together, we study a Bible passage together and interact over it. We celebrate the Lord's Supper, we sing. But August 6th, so Sunday, August 6th, all the house churches will take a break and we will meet together in Minnehaha Falls for a baptism celebration. So if you are interested in being baptized, if you've considered that, you have questions about it, if you're part of TCC, feel free to ask your house church leader or one of the elders. If you're visiting here and you're interested in finding out more, feel free to ask anybody you see up front or kind of in serving roles. So, one other thing I was going to say, since there was so much response to National Night Out that Jose posted, just an encouragement that's coming up next Tuesday. I know we're super excited to meet our new neighbors, so, maybe consider joining that or doing that. So that's kind of a great way to just engage in community more. So George is going to do the teaching. The passage that he's going to be working through, the text is up on the screen, and it is also in your handout if that's helpful to have you. And I think the handouts are there on the table. So again, welcome, and thank you for being here.
It's good to see everybody. It's been a couple months for me. Lawrence has done a great job with the first half of this series on Ecclesiastes. I just wanted to make a few comments here at the beginning about the series in general. Lawrence has done a great job juxtapositioning the things in the text that the preacher, the author, is emphasizing that bring happiness, but also cause suffering. And, the happiness that is experienced is fleeting. That's why so many statements are saying, all of these pursuits are vanity. It's a chasing after a wind. You can't grasp it. And so the reader's journey begins. So when we start reading the book of Ecclesiastes, there's just this overwhelming sense and number of statements that are just saying that life is vain, life is meaningless, life is like the wind. You just can't grasp any sort of meaning or fulfillment or happiness. But what we've seen and what Lawrence has been emphasizing is that the key to making sense of this life that's got potential for happiness but is also full of suffering, suffering you can't figure out, suffering you can't control or conquer, and happiness that seems to be fleeting. The fear of God is what brings these two things together and makes sense of them. And so far what we've seen about the fear of God it brings an element into our lives that helps us interpret these things. And what I want to show, or I think what it shows, is that if you have a fear of God, one of the things, there are several elements that I want to point out here. If you have a fear of God, along with that comes a recognition of human limits. Humans can't solve all of the problems of the world, and the problems of the world seem to be overwhelming. Second, having a fear of God recognizes that we are part of something eternal, that we can't figure it all out, but with a fear of God, we recognize there's an eternality to all things, and that we do have some important role to play. Another thing is that if we have a fear of God, we recognize that we're going to be held accountable. We're going to be held accountable to the actions of our lives. We're going to be held accountable for what we do. And so that's a very important element, because what we see, you fear God. And at the end of the book, we've seen, he's speaking to young people. He says, young people, do whatever your heart desires, but know that you're going to have to stand before God and answer for whatever it is you find yourself doing. Another thing is that we discover with the fear of God that the things that God has provided for us to experience happiness through are not things, they're not sources of happiness in and of themselves. And in that, we just have been discovering that it is God that provides happiness. It is God that provides a sense of meaning. You're going to have to just take the front row, fam. And it is God that provides satisfaction. So there are things that God works through, that He has created, to give us a sense of meaning and happiness and fulfillment. But if we take God out of it, it's not going to work, which means that it is God through His Spirit. Now, the text of Ecclesiastes doesn't spend a whole lot of time on a doctrine of the Holy Spirit, but you have to infer from the text, if God is at work and the one that gives happiness, and we're all experiencing the same material things, and the difference for those who fear God is that God has done something in them, that God is doing a work through His Spirit to bring about those things. And so those are some of the big ideas of Ecclesiastes that we just continue to look at. And so the other thing I want to say tonight about the book of Ecclesiastes and why we're doing the series, there's two things. There's a cultural reason that we're doing this series right now, why we think it's important for our culture, and also because of where the church is at in America. And so first of all, cultural, we see and we hear, observe, and even experience that we as a people are increasingly burdened by mental and physical sickness. The book of Ecclesiastes speaks to things in life that help us to be happy and that overcome physical and mental sickness. We are a people that live in the midst of abundance, but yet are more and more unhappy. And because Ecclesiastes is speaking to these things, as Deirdre mentioned, it's speaking to these truths that we're all asking questions about. If Ecclesiastes has pinpointed the specific things in life that are problematic and that are either causing or symptoms of suffering, and then it is pointing specifically the reader to, hey, here's how to overcome these things and to discover a life of happiness, it is a very timely and appropriate book. And for us as Christians, we should be embodying these things of all peoples. And so that culturally, I think it's just so suited for where we're at and what we're experiencing as a culture. And second, the state of the church. And so, traditions emerge over history that really create a character for various traditions or denominations within Christianity. And I think that Ecclesiastes points the people of God to a tradition or to a trajectory that I think is altogether different than what we see in some of the big Christian movements. In contrast to mainline Protestantism, Ecclesiastes recognizes that God must work and does work through His Spirit to shape individual lives. Mainline Protestantism wanted to get rid of the miracles, the supernatural aspects. Well, Ecclesiastes is saying the supernatural is a part of what it means to be a happy person. The second are the political right, evangelicalism. In contrast to that, Ecclesiastes sees power expressed through God in the form of wisdom and godliness. I'm working through 2 Timothy right now, just in my own personal life, and it speaks to people that pretend to be godly. They have the appearance of godliness, but deny its power. And the power of God does not come through political means. The power of God comes through wisdom and godliness. Fundamentalist pietism, in contrast, Ecclesiastes is in contrast to fundamentalist pietism. So when I say fundamentalist pietism, I mean there is a kind of a resistance or even a kind of an opposition to the experience of joy in the material things that God has created. Instead, what we see in Ecclesiastes, in contrast to that, is that Ecclesiastes encourages us to embrace the material world to experience joy. There's not a resistance to it. There's not a fear of it. It's, hey, God has created a material world for us to enjoy. And lastly, prosperity gospel. In contrast to the prosperity gospel, Ecclesiastes doesn't see suffering as a lack of faith. We just, in our house church last week, somebody shared that their family member is going through just terrible sickness. And the church that this person's a part of really kind of preaches and teaches, and this is not a small tradition in terms of what is out there, preaches and teaches that suffering due to sickness is due to a lack of faith. And if you had more faith, you could overcome and be healed. Well, Ecclesiastes does not see suffering as an issue of lack of faith. It sees it as a reality. Suffering exists in this world in a whole variety of ways. And guess what? Humans are limited, and we're not going to be able to solve it. But in the midst of it, we can find joy. And so I think that Ecclesiastes provides what I call, and Dietrich Bonhoeffer mentions this in his book on community. He doesn't develop it. It's a down-to-earth, religionless Christianity. Religionless. If these are the core elements of what God has put into His creation for us as human beings to find happiness and meaning and fulfillment and satisfaction in life in the fear of God, then these are the things that we should really be embodying. So it's a religionless approach to the happy life. And honestly, this has been a part of, if it hasn't been spoken, I think we've tried to live it. This has been a big part of significant part of the vision and culture and characteristic of TCC that we've tried to develop, which is a big part of why we have emphasized and put our structure around house churches, because it's family, it's everyday life, it's real world. And the more we can participate in community with each other, the more we are interacting around these things. And so those are just some of the big picture things I wanted to say. And on to today's topic, which is food and drink. And so, when we were putting the schedule together, I really wanted to make sure that I would preach this sermon, because it's Jesus I love the most, okay? And obviously fearing God, eventually we get to Jesus, and then it has such a great emphasis on what your wife bringing you joy. And so that, number 2 love of my life is my wife. And then food and drink, it's obviously, if you know me very well, it is a massive, okay, kids, okay, so Ecclesiastes doesn't mention kids, interestingly enough. So that'll be a question for later as to why. It's a great question. I lump family into all of the passages on wife and marriage. I looked for the topic of cycling, but I couldn't find it, so I can't preach a series on that. But anyway, it is hitting all of the big areas of life that I really feel passionate about. So I'm excited about today's message, and there's no way it's going to be a 20-minute sermon, Deirdre. So Ecclesiastes 2:24 through 26. There is nothing better for a person than that he should eat and drink and find enjoyment in his toil. This also I saw is from the hand of God. For apart from him, who can eat or who can have enjoyment? For to the one who pleases him, God has given wisdom and knowledge and joy. But to the sinner he has given the business of gathering and collecting, only to give to the one who pleases God. This is also vanity and a striving after wind. And so this summary, this concluding part about God's intent for us to find joy in our work and in our food and our drink, it follows a passage that explains the vanity of devoting yourself to work for the purpose of happiness. And it's like, well, wait a minute, didn't he just say we're supposed to find enjoyment in our work and then in our food and drink? So he's promoting, the preacher, the author, is promoting the happiness found in work and the fruits then of our work, which is food and drink. And so what you really see here is two intents, two approaches to living your life. The first approach is the approach that believes that your work is going to make you happy. What you achieve through your work, what you do with your work is going to make you happy. The second intent is the goal to enjoy your work and the fruits of it. Okay, so how are those two things different? Well, one is working to accumulate. You see that work is something that you do to accumulate over time. The work in and of itself is not what you're enjoying, because the passage earlier says, you work and you work and you work but you don't have anything to leave to the next generation because it got wasted. We're going to look at one of those passages. Or you don't know who comes after you. You've got this big pile of stuff that you've accumulated through your work, which was your goal, the intent to accumulate. But then you don't know what the person coming after you is going to do with it. And so you work and you work and you work to accumulate. Versus you work because you enjoy it, and you work because you enjoy what it brings you in terms of the everyday pleasures of food and drink. Now, this, I think, has two implications. One, we should pursue a work that we enjoy. I think that's an implication. Find a work that you enjoy doing and do that work. Satisfaction in the work itself. All right? Don't think about necessarily as your top priority what your work is going to accumulate for you. Find a work that you enjoy doing. The second thing is we should pursue eating and drinking for enjoyment. If it is God's purpose for food and drink to bring us happiness, then pursue food and drink for happiness. And we're going to follow that up more later on another passage. I think that these intents are vastly different. So if you think about what does work to accumulate reveal? What does work to accumulate reveal? Why do we work to accumulate things, to store up things? I think that if we think about it, there's a recognition that deep down, we don't know if we're ever going to have enough. We don't know if we're going to have what we need when we need it, which then also creates anxiety and fear and a restlessness. I think that working to accumulate, to store up stuff, also reveals that there is a sense that I am alone responsible to provide for myself, which comes down to the reality that there isn't a perception or a belief that it is God that ultimately provides. If I have to just keep storing up and accumulating for myself because because nobody else will, and I may get to a point in my life where I don't have enough, it's all on you. It's all on you. However, if you work to enjoy the work and to, you got to, we're going to see a passage later, to eat, you have to work. So we have to work. Work to enjoy the work and work to enjoy the fruits of the labors of that work. Underneath that is a recognition that God does exist and provides for our good. You're not working to accumulate for the future. You're working to enjoy the work and to enjoy your food and drink today. So there's an immediacy to it. There's a here and now to it. A here and now that recognizes what I need for the day, I have. God has provided it. I can enjoy it. And there's no fear or anxiety around it. There's not a fear of the future, am I going to have enough? There's a recognition that God has provided through His creation for what we need. I mean, there's a reason why Jesus instructs his people, ask God for your daily bread. For your daily bread. It's the here and now. When you have the here and now, you can enjoy the here and now. Don't worry about the future, Jesus says. So there's an ability to enjoy our work and the food and the drink that it provides on a daily basis. And so Ecclesiastes is kind of bringing us back to don't contemplate and worry about the future so much. God has given you the here and now, enjoy it. And there's this, because that's what it means, that's a part of what it means to have a fear of God. Man has its limits. Humanity has its limits. We have to depend on God for something, and one of those things is food and drink. And that then generates gratitude, and gratitude is always an expression of joy. I have something that is bringing me happiness, that is bringing a sense of fulfillment, and I am going to express that joy in thanks to the one who has provided it. So remember, this is the person who fears God. The first time I would say that this was massively impressed upon me was in 1996. It was my first trip overseas, not including Canada. First trip to Nigeria, which Canada isn't really overseas. We just cross a land border, isn't it? So my first trip to Nigeria. And the entire experience from the moment I stepped into the airport until 2 weeks later, the entire 2-week experience it just blew my mind. But one of the early days, I was in the house that I was staying in this village, and I just wanted a candy bar. I just wanted a candy bar. When here, okay, I could probably walk to a half a dozen places within 3 blocks of my house to get a candy bar if there's not one in my pantry. I couldn't go and get a candy bar. I couldn't go get a soft drink. The most basic of things that I took for granted back home, I couldn't take for granted there. And then throughout the whole time, I'm not eating what I really enjoyed eating. That's a whole other story. I tried goat head for the first time, brains, bones, eyes included, and that was not a pleasant experience. But anyway, what that really impressed upon me that I have got to. I've always enjoyed eating, but I can't say that from that to that point, I didn't enjoy eating with the depth of gratitude that stirred in me, and it's never left me. We take seriously praying before dinner and when we eat at home because we cannot take it for granted. And that's what the fear of God generates in us. And it shapes, as the text says, this experience of wisdom and knowledge. Second passage, Ecclesiastes 5:13 through 18. There's a grievous evil that I have seen under the sun. Riches were kept by their owner to his hurt, and those riches were lost in a bad venture. And he is father of a son, but he has nothing in his hand. As he came from his mother's womb, he shall go again, naked as he came, and shall take nothing for his toil that he may carry away in his hand. This also is a grievous evil. Just as he came, so shall he go, and what gain is there to him who toils for the wind? Moreover, all his days he eats in darkness, in much vexation and sickness and anger. Behold, what I have seen to be good and fitting is to eat and drink and find enjoyment in all the toil with which one toils under the sun, the few days of his life that God has given him, for this is his lot. This passage is making a similar point. This man has worked very, very hard all of his life for the purpose of accumulating things and for the purpose of becoming rich. Now, the text doesn't automatically say that rich people are evil people. There are rich and generous people in the wisdom literature. This person is not a rich and generous person. This person is a rich and greedy person. The word that it says here, it says that he kept all of his riches. It's not saved all of his riches. It's not invested all of its riches. The word is actually guarded. So he just kept piling up all this money, and he was guarding that money. But because of his greed, he ran across a get-rich-quick scheme, invested all of his money into that get-rich-quick scheme, and lost everything. And so here he is. He's not dead yet. He has nothing. He has a young son. The young son has nothing. He can't give anything to them. So there's this greed that has motivated this desire to make even more money. And he uses all of what he's been guarding. He loses everything. And this man suffers from anxiety and anger. And the mental distress has caused him physical sickness. That's what we see in our own world. And it says that in his eating, he eats in darkness. Now, it's not saying that he doesn't have the lights on in his dining room. It's saying that he's eating, but his mind and his spirit is so clouded with anger and anxiety and bitterness that he can't enjoy his food. He's got food. He can't enjoy it. A life without God leads to a life intent to accumulate, and this inhibits wisdom and then opens you up to all these kinds of foolish schemes that he lost all this money in. There's a book published, the third edition was published about 10 years ago called Affluenza, and I want to read just a quote from it because it's not just Ecclesiastes that is saying this. And I would say that, Solomon is writing Ecclesiastes kind of as an entry into all of the wisdom literature of that time. And there's a lot of wisdom that comes from world and secular philosophers and people that think about these things. What Solomon is bringing is this notion of fearing the God of the Bible. Anyway, this book, Affluenza, it says, a powerful virus has infected American society, threatening our wallets, our friendships, our families, our communities, and our environment. We call the virus affluenza. And because the United States has become the economic model for most of the world, the virus is now loose on every continent. Affluenza's costs and consequences are immense, though often concealed. Untreated, the disease can cause permanent discontent. In our view, the affluenza epidemic is rooted in the obsessive, almost religious quest for economic expansion, accumulation, that has become the core principle of what is called the American dream. It's rooted in the fact that our supreme measure of national progress is that quarterly ring of the cash register we call the gross domestic product. It's rooted in the idea that every generation will be materially wealthier than its predecessor, and that somehow each of us can pursue that single-minded end without damaging the countless other things that we hold dear. It doesn't work that way. The contention of this book is that if we don't begin to reject our culture's incessant demands to buy now, we will pay later in ways that we can scarcely imagine, and the bill has already come due. So a life without God, a life with God in contrast to a life without God, is a daily experience of joy, believing in His goodness and provision, which generates within us gratitude and worship, generosity. I want to close here on just some three shorter statements. Ecclesiastes 10:19 is one. Bread is made for laughter, and wine gladdens life, and money answers everything. So these are truisms. They're not airtight promises that always hold true. But I think it's important to recognize what they're saying and ask ourselves, do we take advantage of their truthfulness? I'm not going to deal with the subject of money tonight. That's going to be a later sermon. But look at this. Bread is made for laughter. It doesn't say bread is made for fuel. Obviously, that's a part of bread and the nutrition that we need. But it says bread is made for laughter. And I think this idea of being made comes into the next phrase, and wine gladdens life. So do we believe that so much so that we actually pursue those things for some happiness? Do we pursue eating for happiness? Do we pursue drinking for happiness? I think we should. I think that's what the text is saying. Now, it's not saying pursue bread for your hope or pursue wine for your hope. But it is a gift of God that brings happiness and lightheartedness to our lives. So let's use them for that. Amen. The second one, not up here, Ecclesiastes 4:5, really short verse. The fool folds his hands and eats his own flesh. So this verse is really addressing laziness. Notice that in most all of these passages, the theme of work and food and drink are tied together. So the fool, in this passage, the fool folds his hands, doesn't have any food to eat, and it says that he eats his own flesh. Now, he's obviously not literally eating his own flesh, but the fool who chooses not to work might as well be, because he's killing himself, because he's not working and he's not eating, he's eventually going to die. A man either works and eats and enjoys, or a man does not work and eventually kills himself. That's what it's saying. He eats himself. Last one, Ecclesiastes 5:12. Sweet is the sleep of a laborer, whether he eats little or much, but the full stomach of the rich will not let him sleep. So this verse, let me read it again. Sweet is the sleep of a laborer, whether he eats little or much, but the full stomach of the rich will not let him sleep. So this verse is saying that the type and the amount of food is not the factor. The type of food and the quantity of food is not what makes or breaks us in terms of happiness. What we have here is a greedy rich person versus a non-greedy manual labor. The manual laborers were working for what they needed that day. They got paid a day's wage, and they lived off that day's wage that day. The rich man has been accumulating greedily, The laborer who fears God and enjoys his food and enjoys his sleep hasn't eaten as much as the rich man. But the greedy rich man can't sleep for two reasons. His stomach is too full. I know that all of us have probably, at some point in our lives, eaten too much, too late at night. We try to go to bed and we can't fall asleep because we just feel gross, right? We've all done that. So he can't sleep because he ate too much before going to bed. The other thing is, because he's greedy, he's also got this anxiety, this vexation, this darkness, this bitterness, this fear of his future security. Am I going to have enough? He can't sleep because his mind is not at rest. The type and amount of food is not the critical factor. It's whether we're greedy or not greedy. It's whether or not we have a fear of God. We can be poor and fear God and enjoy life. We can be poor and not fear God and not enjoy life. We can be rich and fear God and enjoy life. We can be rich and not fear God and not enjoy life. And there's a lot more passages, not only in Ecclesiastes, but throughout all the wisdom literature that affirm these things. Now, in conclusion, what I want to do is just go quickly back. In our earlier series this year, we did a series on Jesus. And one of the messages came out of John's first recorded miracle that Jesus did in his turning of 120 gallons of water into the finest wine that it had ever been produced. I want to go there because what John was wanting to say about Jesus, in his first statement about Jesus was this: Jesus wants us, as his creation, Jesus wants humanity to enjoy the abundant and overflowing life. That's what Jesus wants. And that's a theme throughout the Gospel of John. Jesus wants us to experience happiness, meaningfulness, satisfaction, and fulfillment. And that wedding party set a context that really highlighted Jesus' ultimate purposes. See, ultimately, and this fear of God aspect, which is really what the Old Testament's version of what it means to walk in Christ or walk in the Spirit or live by faith. Ultimately, what God is wanting us to do is once again, and the book of Genesis in the early chapters really reflects this so well. God was walking in the cool of the garden with his people. God wants to walk with us once again in his presence, enjoying everything that he has created. Abundant, overflowing, generous living. And so when Jesus wants us to be one with him, it's a wedding celebration, a husband and wife coming together as one. That's why this is a wedding celebration. So Jesus wants us to be one with him. That's made possible by the shedding of his blood, which is reflected in this abundant overflowing of wine at this party. And in shedding his blood, he entered into death, which is what obviously Ecclesiastes speaks a lot about. Every human being eventually dies. What is the point? Well, Jesus rose from the dead, and his resurrection from the dead in the context of this wedding party was that he saved the reputations of the host and of the wedding couple, because it would have been disastrous for them to have run out of wine. They would have lawsuits about those kinds of things. The life of vanity and meaninglessness that ultimately leads to death is what Jesus overcame. And he is wanting us to share that with him. We're not going to leave the suffering of this world. We're not going to do it. Old Testament, New Testament, whatever book of the Bible you want, suffering exists. But how do we find meaningful lives, happy lives, satisfactory lives in the midst of that? It's fearing God. It's trusting in Jesus to secure and give us life in unity with him. Let me pray real quick. Lord God, thank you for the beautiful book of Ecclesiastes. Thank you for its down-to-earth nature. Thank you for the simplicity that it is promoting, and a way to approach each day really with the possibility of knowing you and worshiping you because of what you have so generously provided. In your Son's name, amen. All right. I think a little over 30 minutes. So yeah, so little Q&A time, and I think Deirdre will run around or walk around the microphone.
Kind of nicer that it's a smaller room. Don't have to run so
So,
much.
any questions or comments on the text or the sermon? Any of the comments? We have some time here. Shane's got a comment. My fellow brother in food and drink enjoyment. Shane and I have been enjoying, we would go to movies together in high school and just eat way too much popcorn and drink way too much pop. Shane.
Did that happen? So the only thing I question in what you said is that you learned your love of food in 1993, you said?
I would say that, I think I said that my gratitude.
Okay.
My
because
gratitude.
I would say in high school, you taught me the love of a really good cheeseburger. Not just a regular old cheeseburger, but a really good cheeseburger. And I have carried that way through into adulthood and have passed that on to my nieces and nephews.
What was that at a particular restaurant? Or
no,
what?
I think we were grilling them at home.
I think it's important that I'm glad you asked that, Shane, because if I didn't say it was my gratitude, I mean, you guys, it was a life-changing experience. I did not leave that country the same because I just recognized how so much we had here in the States that was so convenient that was not there. Now, that was in 1996. That was a long time ago. So I would imagine things are different, at least in the major cities. But anyway, I haven't been back since 2003, so I don't know. But that really impressed upon me that I need to be thankful for what God has so generously provided for me because these people don't have it. And I'm not talking about just candy bars and pop, all right? That's just what I wanted at the time. I'd open up the refrigerators, and there would just be a few things in there because they just didn't have access to the fresh stuff every single. I mean, we go into a grocery store in the morning. Everybody's got the shelves all stocked. The freezers are all full. The meat department it's all full, and every day they just keep stocking those shelves all day long. It just was incredible. So it was my gratitude, and that's brought a lot. I would say that has caused me to enjoy my food a lot more.
I think God is honored when we feed other people. There's lots of passages about feeding the widow and the orphan and the immigrant and the poor in the Bible. One of the reasons I chose my occupation as I did is I think God's honored when we feed other people. I also think in our society we are so disconnected. And if somebody is given a plate of food that's really good with somebody else, they might just take a bite and take a pause and look at each other and say, wow, this is good. Maybe they'll even put down their phone. I mean, I know I'm addicted to mine, so I'm sure lots of other people are. And I think one way George and I built a depth of relationship was sharing meals together. George often ate over at our house. On Wednesday nights, we had youth group. George and his brothers came to youth group at our church, and we would go to swim team practice and then come home, and my mom would feed about 5 of us, 5 high school boys who just finished a swim team workout. Mom asked me one day, Shane, do you know how much food gets eaten on Wednesdays here? And I go, no, how much, Mom? However much I put out. And she said she learned the value of bread because it just fills you up. So I have always appreciated that about you, George. And so I would just encourage people, when you can, eat with each other and eat joyfully and smile and communicate. It might start to break down some walls and barriers.
Yeah, another reason why we chose to do house church, to share meals together on a regular basis, because we could have gone into the Lord's Supper in terms of an application of this, and Jesus' time with his disciples, and the fish and the loaves. Jesus really used food in the way God created it to generate joy and happiness. So, anybody else? Thanks, Shane. Ben.
I think you answered some of this already, but just to make sure I'm following, when you were speaking about, this living more in the moment and in the day and not worrying about down the road and do I have enough and things like that. In our world, retirement's a thing, and being able to provide for yourself when you do retire. I think you're not saying that we shouldn't be also being wise and saving for the future.
No, that's a good point. I had it in my sermon text. I'm sorry, Ben.
Well,
go ahead. No,
I think
go ahead.
clarified,
Finish your question.
No, I think you clarified when you said that this man in this second passage that you read, he guarded it. And you said some clarifying things around he didn't save it, he didn't invest it, he guarded it. And so maybe that kind of clarifies.
Yeah, I know. I'm glad for the question. Because there is a theme in our culture: eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow you die. So the wise person in the wisdom literature is a person that works and has and enjoys daily, but also saves for his children's children. The foolish man is the one who spends everything he has, is another proverb. And so I don't think it's necessary. I wouldn't say that it's a balance. I would say that it's we work and we save, but it's not with the obsession of, I'm not going to have enough. God's not going to provide for me. We save so that we can use it for what may be needed in the future and what other people may need. So it's a saving for the purpose of needs and generosity, not saving for the purpose of, I don't know if I'm ever going to have enough. You see what I mean? It's just this perspective of what you see as the source of what you need to survive and to be a blessing to other people. And people that don't know God and people that don't have a fear of God can't have that sense of confidence that God will provide for them, which He's promised. He's promised for those who fear Him and love Him. So, good question, Ben. Yeah. Jose.
So I'm learning that, and I believe that I am in the process of learning to fear God. Because either you fear God or you don't fear God. And so is there somewhere in between, not to bargain, not to negotiate with them? What about Christians who are drinking milk and eventually eat meat? Or what about this edification that we're being edified, we're being taught, we're learning how to give up old ways of thinking, old thoughts? So much stuff to learn in the Christian life, of be aware of the desires of the flesh and temptations, where seasons come by and you don't do those things that are not good anymore. You stop doing certain things, but does that mean that if you still are sinning in many ways? I mean, that fear of God, I think, for myself, not for others, I've been learning that, and I think I'm learning that, and I'm making better choices. I'm being more wise as I'm learning in a life what things should do or not to do, what should I agree not to agree with, and then repenting, confessing, and God's changing the heart. But while I'm doing this, I really appreciate, and I'm teaching my kids, this food we're eating is from God. We pray for our food, the water we're about to drink. I make sure that we're putting our phones down. We're not eating something and being on a phone or technology or something, and not appreciating the moment of eating a steak or a hamburger or something great. So it's like if we have kids or little kids at home, something that I take not for granted, but I'm learning the gratitude of appreciating all those little things that add up food, a place to live, water, air conditioning your home, all the things, because I don't want my kids to grow up spoiled. I grew up that way, lost in darkness, and I don't want them to learn, okay, you bite something, ooh, it's gross, and throw the whole plate away. I've seen it done. We go to the buffet, and I'm like, hey, just measure yourself, get what's appropriate. But I'm learning that while I'm in the process of this feeling the Lord, I still can enjoy and appreciate what God is providing, while in the midst of still maturing in the wisdom. God's providing wisdom and knowledge and understanding. But I start seeing all this appreciation of food when I go to the grocery stores. It's amazing. We don't see it, but I see it. All the meat stocked up, like you said, and all the food is stocked up. All the things we get like, oh, no big deal and whatever, you know. But I look at it as a blessing that we can still go and enjoy our food.
Yeah, I think fearing God or not fearing God, I don't think it's a switch. I think that it's more or less kind of an orientation that grows, and as we grow more mature, that's like a energizing power, that fear of God that continues to push us on into growth, and that God continues to help us understand more and more of who He is and what it means to live in that fear. So, other thoughts? Emily?
Okay, I don't know if it's totally related, but what role does, is fasting in opposition to this, or is that part of enjoying food more, or are they just totally unrelated
Yeah, and
subjects?
interestingly enough, there's no command in the New Testament to fast. The ancient Israel had a command to fast once a year as an entire nation. So there's no, we see people that in the New Testament were fasting. So it's not a command, but what fasting does do is that it creates, there's the Old Testament passage talked of it as afflicting yourself. And so what it does, I think it does a number of things. One, it helps us grow to endure suffering, because we are afflicting ourselves, and we intentionally afflict ourselves so that we can better endure temptations in other areas of life. So when things get hard, hey, I've been practicing endurance by not eating when things get hard. And so it's kind of a spiritual training option, because it's not commanded, but that's typically what it's been for. And to grow our appreciation for when we're done fasting, to grow our appreciation for what we have. Even if you've just fasted for a day and have gone without food, 3 meals and no snacks for 24 hours, that will create within you a greater gratitude for the 3 meals that you eat on all 364 days of the year. It does generate gratitude. If you do that regularly, I would suspect that it grows over time as you do it. So those would be my 2 comments on fasting.
I have a question too. Just listening to the sermon and everyone's question, it's been mulling in my mind. These verses seem so appropriate for America.
Yeah.
And, I keep thinking of de Tocqueville, who came in the late 1700s and was like, what is with Americans? They have so much, and yet they seem so unhappy, and just spending time in a small village in a different country where, it's Europe, it's France, and yet still, the refrigerators are the size of what college students have, and right not hoarding, and so anyway, you can go, a lot of the same things that have been shared. What is it in us Americans specifically that maybe gravitate towards this side of not enjoying, of feeling like we're not going to have enough, and I think part of the reason I ask that is because maybe if people had comments or insights, I would love to hear them, because maybe if we had some insight into that, it would help us not only to understand ourselves but our neighbors, and learn how to maybe seek the welfare of the city and the benefit of ourselves and others. So I don't know if you have thoughts or others. Like, what is it about Americans that for hundreds of years we're not just happy with a good meal and a day's work?
Yeah, I was reading something. Oh, it was, or was I listening to something? It was a French person, and they made a comment just about, I just don't understand those Americans. They just like eat for fuel, and they just don't have the culture around enjoying food, you know, and this person couldn't understand that. But anyway, I just was making a comment while you walked to the next person that had a question. I don't know what it is about Americans. I'd have to go to that book, Affluenza, to see if they make some comments on that. I've got a few thoughts, but I'm not sure as to why. I don't know if you can come with a why. Anna?
Well, I have a question,
Yeah.
but also kind of maybe a comment. I don't know. I mean, I wonder if it's partly just that our culture is so, we just have that abundance, so we lack the gratitude. But then the other question, but I mean, there's other cultures that do too. But I was wondering, you seem to use gratefulness and fearing God kind of interchangeably in your answers. So do you see that? How do you see that connected? And is that part of the answer?
That's a good question. And I didn't have this in my sermon. I think I had it in my write-up. You know, there's a quote in Hebrews. It says, if you want to please God, you've got to believe that he exists and that he's a rewarder of those who seek him. He who comes to God must believe that he exists and that he is a rewarder of those who seek him. So I believe that an element of fearing God has to begin with a recognition that he is for our good. If you don't believe that God is for your good, I don't think you can approach him. If you believe that God is out to get you, or if you believe that God is wanting to squash your fun, or if you believe that God, you know, and a lot of times we feel this way because we've done something wrong. And so we feel guilty, we feel shame. If we expose ourselves to God, it's going to make it worse, we believe. And that's part of the deception that exists in our world, the darkness. So if we, an appropriate fear of God has to have as a key element this understanding that God is for our good. And what I experience that is good in this life, I experience because of God's goodness towards me. And so that generates a gratitude and a worship. I think it all just kind of ties together into one feeling. But it begins with that belief. Do I believe that God is good and is for my good? Or do I believe that God is bad and is for my bad? And if we can't come to grips with that, then he's always our enemy, and we're going to do whatever we can to make it in this world without him. And Ecclesiastes is ultimately trying to press its readers to say, hey, you can't live in this world and find meaning, fulfillment, happiness, health, unless you make God a part of your life. That's what he's saying. That's the gospel. Ecclesiastes is the gospel. You want life, you're going to find it in God. And then the New Testament teaches us that's through Jesus. So, good question. Did that answer your question? Okay. Probably one more. We got to start a little bit late. Andrew.
I'm just thinking about how, in my experience, it's not just the quality of the food and the drink, but like just appreciating what someone provides to you or makes for you. In my travels in other countries and in the culture I grew up in, like eating what someone gives you and appreciating it opens a lot of doors to greater relationship with those people. And I think it gives you opportunities to share the gospel, and it just creates a great I don't know what the word is, but just it really creates a bond and opens doors. And I just think that whatever you can do to appreciate food with people can really do a lot. So it's not just the quality of the food. Sometimes it's not even good food, but like just to appreciate that someone's giving it to you, and then that can be really powerful.
Yeah, I think similar to what Shane was saying. Yeah, and that's, again, the only way to make a good meal better is to have it with somebody. Yeah, yeah. Again, which is why Jesus says, hey, get together weekly and have food together. There's a spiritual thing about, God has created it. If you share something that God has created, that is a spiritual experience, or could be if we go into those with the fear of the Lord. So, all right. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for your activity and involvement. It's good to be back. Thanks, Deirdre.